many of you might know that in March, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, announced the so-called Rearm Europe plan, which is a 800 billion euro plan to strengthen Europe's potential to defend itself, like defense capabilities. So as part of this plan, the EU wants to ease the deficit limiting rules for member states, and it offers these member states massive billion euro loans to invest in military defense. So this decision came shortly after Donald Trump was inaugurated, and after increasing requirements from the US to invest on Europe to invest more on its own defense. Now, the question then for us is, who is going to pay for this militarization here in Europe? And unfortunately, and as usual, we got used to it. We are going to pay for it, and the workers in Europe are going to pay for it. And that will happen through social cuts or corporate tax breaks for big corporates, austerity-based war economy instead of long-term sustainable investments. And we will also pay with a strengthened, already growing far right here in Europe. So I will get back to this point in just a moment, but just to give you an overview, it's good to understand the dynamics behind these plans. And we have to understand the historical relationship, the historical relationships between Europe, the US, and other global powers. So after World War II, the US needed allies to counter a developing Soviet Union. And it also needed an ally against a growing socialism and communism here in Europe. The prime examples being, for example, France and Italy. So as part of a strategic understanding, the Europe and US built a so-called Western Bloc. And that was through the Marshall Plan, a NATO deal, and an increased dollarization. So simply speaking, what was going on here, the deal was that US would build up their military defense and military presence with all these bases that we see here in Europe and all over the world. Well, Europe could invest this saved money that they didn't have to spend on defense on building or rebuilding the continent, and importantly, compete against the Soviet Union. So, while this arrangement brought stability in Europe, it came at a cost, and that cost was limited autonomy, which of course is different between countries, but for example, France had much more leeway to spend on their military defense, while Germany was much more dependent on the US. But Europe became also economically dependent, and this was through tech infrastructure, financial systems like SWIFT, and dominant US dollar. And this kind of reinforced the reliance on US hegemony and NATO protection. So as long as US could keep that dominance, everything worked well here in Europe. But as we can see, this empire is crumbling now. And so this becomes a little bit of a problem for Europe. And we can see it in its last military failures. Afghanistan and Iraq are two examples where they tried to revive the empire, but that kind of backfired. And then the decline is also evident in seeing how US and Israel are isolated in the UN General Assembly in its support for continued Israeli genocidal war against Palestinians. But we also see, and this is also interesting, an economic shift, and this relates to Europe as well. China and the rest of the BRICS countries have outgrown the US power or dominance in the world. And we can just look at IMF's reviews on trends and projections to see that the total input of BRICS countries kind of exceeded that of the G7 countries in 2024. And even more interesting for us in this context is that the complete stagnation of European growth. For example, the clearest example is Germany, the industrial powerhouse in Europe, which kind of flatlined. It underperformed with 0% GDP growth in 2024. But we see similar trends here in Europe. So it's clear that the European deindustrialization is evident, it's inevitable, and even it's not only us as socialists saying that, even EU centrist figures like Mario Draghi is talking about a slow agony that was self-imposed by self-limiting and underinvestment in Europe. And meanwhile, you have US and China that have been investing on long-term technologies like big tech, AI, social media, also green energy, and this type of things. So, and I understand this is not an economic discussion. So the reason why I'm talking about this is that this financial relationship puts Europe in a sticky situation. On the one hand, it is extremely dependent on the US for defense, tech infrastructure, and financial stability. But on the other hand, it has relied on imports from China and dependence on Russian cheap gas. So I don't know if you've heard of it. There is a term in economics that says a beggar thy neighbor policy. It describes a situation where a country helps its own economy at the expense of others. And the Trump administration and the US establishment in general, they have realized its own decline. And true to this capitalist dog-eat-dog philosophy that they have, this declining empire, smelling the weakness of Europe right now, is demanding that Europe should support blindly and submit to US requirements. And the EU doesn't have much leverage anymore, especially since it's broke with this cheap imports from China and Russia. So now US is playing a victim and is requiring Europe to defend its own borders. So basically the post-World War II is off and it has to defend its own border. Or as former Vice President of the European Commission nicely said, that we have to defend the garden against the jungle. And this comment might seem, a bit off, to put it mildly, but it is rooted in the European colonial imperialist and racist mindset. And this shines through when we see how the EU top and elites value white European, Ukrainian lives much higher than Palestinian suffering or lives. And this all ties up with Rearm Europe and gives us a prediction of where this is going. First of all, the argument that this plan is response to Russian threat is hollow. European militarization and rearmament has been continuously growing, and just in 2021, it doubled its investment or budget compared to the 7 years before that. So let's not get fooled here. It's not about defending ourselves against Russia. It's about creating tighter bonds with NATO, and it's about preparing for a crisis and war. And this military Keynesianism, which spends on defense to stimulate economic growth, is a short-sighted solution to a much bigger economic problem. And this is something that the European worker is going to pay for in the end. And because this increased military spending will lead to further cutbacks on social spending, so salaries, vacations, pensions, all these kind of things. And then while the European workers or population becomes increasingly frustrated, and rightfully so, the foot soldiers of Trump, so Elon Musk, J.D. Vance, they meet up and cozy up with European far-right and fascist leaders here. And then with vague rhetoric and scapegoating, they convince Europeans that the real enemies are the Muslims, trans people, unions, and socialist woke people, and not capitalism. And so this fits into this jungle versus garden mentality, and we grow an acceptance for far right-wing parties. So, just to, as you can see, the U.S. and European elite is waging a war against workers from all angles here, and the far right and fascists here in Europe, they sense that the conditions are ripe for them, and they got together, for example, in February this year, far right leaders to adopt slogans like "Make Europe Great Again." Even though they display differences in national interests, every time they meet, every time they connect, they learn from each other. And this is a danger. But we can do that too. So I'm going to end up with on a positive note. We can also change things. We are getting together here as well. And what we need to do is become more assertive, more offensive, and where we fight against any initiatives that cause the downfall of Europeans and workers globally. And we think that socialist organizations should collaborate across national borders to oppose further militarization and gains from the far right. So in June, the NATO top is going to meet in Den Haag, and and they want to enhance its military and war preparation. And the European left should come together to protest against NATO war plans. But these protests and actions have to come from a left that stresses imperialism as a system. So we need to separate our efforts from growing tendencies, including from the far right that opposes NATO but supports whitewashes rival imperialist countries like Russia. And today it's more urgent than ever. We need to build a continent-wide united front against imperialism, regardless of the camp. Against fascism, and as well the hand that feeds them, capitalism. So I'm going to end up with a little bit of cheesy part here, but so we are a small group here, maybe quite bigger than I expected, but still it's a small group. And the future may look bleak, but Eduardo Galeano, a writer from Uruguay, supposedly said, "Many small people in small places doing small things can change the world." And I just want to emphasize that doesn't mean individualistic efforts. What we need is to organize ourselves and to really go against this far-right stream and this pro-war stream. So here we have organizations with us. We have the International Socialists, we have TNI and the Vredesbeweging group and ROOD. Talk with us, and we need to get together. This is an urgent situation.
Thank you, Santiago. We're gonna, now go to Naomi. Thank you very much. Yes, Naomi, please take it away.
Thanks. Thank you, comrades, for inviting me, and thank you for hosting this very important discussion. I wrote something down as well, because otherwise I'm gonna yap way too long. We gathered today to talk about NATO and how to dismantle it. That's not an easy task. And to do that, we must speak clearly about the forces that perpetuate war and prevent peace, not as abstract evils, but as material instruments of class domination. Let's be clear, NATO is not a peacekeeping alliance. It is the armed wing of transnational capital. Since 1949, NATO has operated as a tool for the imperialist powers to enforce hegemony over the periphery and suppress any challenges to the capitalist world order. From Korea to Yugoslavia, from Afghanistan to Libya, NATO's interventions have never served the interests of the working class. They serve capital. They defend markets, secure natural resources, open up economies to Western corporations, and crush resistance, whether it comes from socialist states, national liberation movements, or even bourgeois states that fall out of line. We should not be fooled by the rhetoric of humanitarianism. The ruling class has always wrapped its violence in moral language. What they call liberation, we must recognize as counter-revolution. What they call stability, we must expose as class domination maintained through force. Under capitalism, war is not an aberration, it is a necessity. Imperialist war arises not from failures of diplomacy, but from the contradictions of capital itself. When capital can no longer expand peacefully, it turns to the sword, and NATO is that sword, wielded against any threat to the profitability and dominance of the ruling class. This is why we cannot know peace under capitalism, because capitalism is founded on exploitation and maintained through coercion. Peace, true peace, can never be achieved so long as private property, class society, and imperialist competition remains intact. The struggle for peace is inseparable from the struggle for socialism. Only when the means of productions are collectively owned, only when imperialism is overthrown, only when the working class holds power globally, only then we can begin to speak seriously about lasting peace. While the struggle against capitalism and NATO is a big one, I see that my generation, young people around me, begin to recognize that this system is not giving them a future. They see the climate collapsing, begin to recognize that rents rising, wages stagnating, and genocide carried out in their name. They are rejecting the false promises of neoliberalism and asking deeper questions about who benefits from this system. Our task is to help them connect the dots, to show them that capitalism at home and imperialism abroad are two sides of the same coin. That the same system that exploits workers in Albert Heijn warehouses also funds wars for oil. That the police who repress protests in the street are trained by the same governments that bomb nations into submission. And that the struggle for socialism is inseparable from the struggle against war, empire, and NATO. That's why we, together with the Nieuwe Vredesbeweging and some other organizations, are in a coalition. It's called the Tegentop Coalition. So we are organizing a counter summit this June in The Hague and a protest on Sunday, June 22nd, right? Yeah. We have some flyers here, and I think that's a good start to organize young people, organize the working class against NATO. So yeah, that was my part.
Thank you so much, Naomi. And now we go to Niels. There you go. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us here today in this warm and sweaty room. I think it speaks to the times that, you know, rising temperatures in the climate, and yet all of you chose to be here in this packed room to talk about imperialism and war and how to stop it. So thanks for coming and doing that and not eating ice cream at this moment. I've been active in the peace movement for 20 years now. I work at an organization called International Institute, TNI. It was founded as part of the decolonial movement. Our second director, Orlando Latoyer, he was murdered by a military regime of Pinochet. He was part of the government in Chile, and then when that government was couped, he led the institute and he died in a car bomb by that same government. So our organization is intimately tied to the threat that militarization and war and rising fascism poses. And in those 50 years, we've tried to maintain a position of expose, oppose, and propose. So we expose what is happening in the world and why capitalist domination, what it means and how it happens. Oppose by working together with movements, but also propose new ways of organizing and thinking. So I've been active in the peace movement since the 9/11 attacks and the then attack on Afghanistan. And we saw, I think, very clearly then with the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, a peace movement that was building up strength and it was connecting globally. The protests against the Iraq war were the single largest international protest that the world has ever seen, with people all over the globe connecting on the same day, marching out in the streets, tens of thousands of folks here in Amsterdam, but millions and millions and millions globally. And I think although it didn't stop the war, it did connect the dots in a sense of what is happening here in terms of an unjust war, and it gave people strength to oppose those interventions. And I think it did really give a pushback to warmongers who wanted to go after Iran maybe, or after other countries and bomb them into submission. So in the past decade and a half, I think from a lot of active Western interventions and large wars, we've seen a shift to where the military-industrial complex in Europe has been shifting gears, with less bullets being fired by Western powers to buy their bullets. They've tried to market other means of war making. The EU now has the most lethal borders in the world, with tens of thousands of people drowning in the Mediterranean and an ever militarized border security. It is the military-industrial complex that is behind many of those inventions to militarize those borders. And it is also those same companies that actively sell weapons with the help and understanding and legitimization of the EU to, for instance, the Libyan Coast Guard, which is complacent in shooting at refugees. Militias in Sudan are being armed by both the European military-industrial complex and support of the EU actively, because we need to defend our borders. So while European interventionism, in a sense, has maybe not seen many active wars in the past decade and a half, there have been people murdered by the same companies and with the same countries involved. And at the same time, the big enemy now, Russia, a decade ago was the friend of European powers. As was said, we needed Russian gas. It was Shell pumping up that gas. And Shell was very happy to not speak about the horrible conditions that were happening in Russia and the oligarchy it was enriching. It is, for the Dutch people, maybe you recognize this picture. You see Putin and Willem-Alexander, then Prince, now King, cheering their glasses. It was Heineken beer that they were cheering on. It was in the Heineken house. It was Dutch capital supported by the royal family that needed to smooch and be close to the Russian rulers and oligarchs, because Western imperialism needed some of that sweet gas. Now they're the enemies. Of course they are the enemies, but back then they were the friends. So the hypocrisy of Europe in who is our friend and who is our enemy, I think, is blatantly obvious. My colleague and comrade Boris Karelitsky is in a Russian prison right now, not for the first time. It's his third arrest. He was arrested by the Soviet Union, he was arrested by Yeltsin, and now he's arrested by Putin for speaking truth to power. So there are Russian folks who speak out against the war machine, as there are Belarusians. For instance, it was Belarusian trade unionists who, at the start of the military war and occupation by Russia and Belarus of Ukraine, who organized themselves and put the trains on the wrong tracks and railroaded them back to the other side of the country so that Russian war machines couldn't go to the front. We don't hear about that resistance of Russian and Belarusian people because, on the one hand, Europe needs an enemy, and on the other hand, Europe doesn't need a story where working class people organize themselves to oppose a brutal war, because that can lead to some very dangerous precedents. So don't take those precedents home, people, if you're wondering what to do. And now, after Russia has become an enemy, the opportunity seized is to rearm Europe, to create new markets for new killing machines. And every killing machine, every tank is a train less for people that we need. It takes away money from housing, from social security, from pensions. And it's really telling to see how little honest, like how the problem, the crisis of the climate crisis is not taken seriously by those in power, and they have never been able to spend the amount of money needed to come up with a serious plan of how to curb climate change. And now that the war machine is steamrolling and making some sweet money for the people in power, now the billions become available for them to build their killing machines. So we understand what is going on. Y'all understand this. What is to be done? Naomi pointed to the protest and summit we're hosting. So as Transnational Institute, together with comrades, we're part of the Nieuwe Vredesbeweging, the new peace movement. We're calling it new because it brings together folks from the older peace movement, which, for instance, Church and Peace in the Netherlands, Stop Wapenhandel in the Netherlands, and those folks who have organized successfully in the past 2 years against the genocide in Gaza. And we've seen that energy and need that energy of those protests to sustain a longer build-up of a movement that will be able to stop coming wars. Because rest assured, war is coming. War for new resources that the European war machine and economy needs is coming. And we better build a movement that can understand why this is happening and know how we can effectively oppose those wars. And for that, we need you. So the new peace movement is a newer organization. There is, I think, maybe some questions and criticism on that, and I welcome this space of comradely intervention where we can really go into discussion about how we should build a peace movement and what hurdles to overcome. But we need you in that. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of people approach us, email us, how can we get involved? And we need younger people, we need more left-wing people with an ideology that doesn't stray from, now Russia is the enemy, but what if the enemy then becomes another country, Is that we need people rooted in a tradition that understands the world as it is and has the energy to sustain movement building for the long run. So join us at the protest, join us at the day before at the Counter Summit, but much more so, join us for the next coming years, because this is going to be a longer fight, and we need young people, socialists, to be involved in that, to build those movements that can oppose the coming wars. Thank you.